Lecture 28 is called the Second World War. I want to follow two themes here. First, this war is truly global in scope. Every continent is impacted, I suppose except for maybe Antarctica. Every ocean, every sea is impacted. We have the greatest casualties in the history of warfare here in the middle of the 20th century. A second theme is how to discuss World War II in a world history context. Do we continue to look for broad patterns, or do we get bogged down in details? Do we look at the bigger structures, or do we look at individual agency? Sticking with our world history theme, we're going to stay with broad patterns, generalizations, making connections and links across time and space. And we're going to concentrate on structure, those bigger structures, as opposed to individual agency. These are distinguishing characteristics of world history. Two approaches in this lecture. World history themes brought to bear on this very complex subject. And then we're going to look at some key decisions that have consequences across the globe. So, world history themes first. We've talked about the world system in here. So let's pursue this for a moment. The Soviet Union withdraws from the world system with its centrally planned communist economy. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan both seek to dominate the world system by colonizing large swaths of the world. Colonized territories in Asia, Africa, South America. They solidify their position on the periphery. You remember our core countries and our countries on the periphery. The core is reorganized with Europe weakened and the United States strengthened. Defeated Germany and Japan rapidly assume their respective places back in the core again. Red China undergoes traumatic attempts to modernize and to industrialize from communist isolation. Now, China, of course, has become part of the core after spending a good portion of the century on the periphery. Another world history theme that we've touched on over the course of the semester is imperialism. So let's bring this theme to bear on the Second World War. Remember that Japanese victories over European imperialists in the Pacific destroyed the myth of white Christian European superiority. European possessions in the Pacific now belonged to the Japanese. Japanese propaganda that they were releasing Asians from Western dominance rang hollow, as the Japanese brutality and exploitation of the Pacific peoples was even worse than that of the Europeans. The Second World War sets in motion the end of imperialism as Great Britain, France, Holland, and even the United States relinquish their colonies. India, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, these places strain for independence, as does Algeria from the French, Indochina, Indonesia and Malaysia from the Dutch. So the imperial system is coming apart here, and the Second World War sets these trends in motion. We've talked about modernization as a theme in world history, so let's bring it to bear here for a moment on the Second World War. Technological progress culminates in the development of the atomic bomb here in 1945. The modern bureaucratic state in Nazi Germany perfects the science of mass murder. War provides the impetus for scientific accomplishments as the state commands sufficient financial strength and human ingenuity to achieve technological wonders. Nationalisms, another theme that we've pursued in this course. Let's bring it to bear here on the Second World War. Nazi Germany coupled nationalism with racism to overturn the existing order in Europe. The Nazis, of course, compiled a list of over 11 million Jews living in Europe. And approximately 6 million of these were killed by the Nazi regime. That's more than 50%. You do that in baseball, you go to the Hall of Fame. The Soviet Union switched from communist rhetoric and dogma to save the motherland once Russia was attacked by Nazi Germany. Again, reverting to Russian nationalism to try to save the country. The Japanese warrior code, the Bushido, allowed for rape and murder on a grand scale against those viewed by the Japanese as inferior. Nationalism is inflamed in imperial territories the world over, as colonized peoples realize that their old masters are now too weak to continue, and that they themselves have contributed much to the Allied victories over Germany and Japan. So you see across the world, colonized territories, the peoples rising up and demanding independence from their imperial masters. We talked about the age of revolutions. I'm just going to make a couple of comments here. Decolonization is accompanied by revolutions in Latin America, all the way to China. These revolutions not only overthrow past masters, but they sometimes undertake dramatic social transformations in attempts to modernize. Witness the ongoing social engineering under Mao Zedong in Red China with the Great Leap Forward. Industrial killing. We haven't really talked about this in this semester so far, but it's pertinent here, and I want to make a couple of comments about it. Industrial killing kind of brings together modernization and nationalism into one very poisonous combination. Germany bombed civilian targets in Western Europe, Rotterdam in Holland, Coventry, London, and other cities in England. The British and then later the United States would in turn begin bombing German cities. So you see that civilians have now become legitimate targets of these modern states. Civilians are fair game. Traditionally in warfare, enemy combatants are viewed as the legitimate targets. And here we've crossed a line in the 20th century. Japan unleashed a frenzy of killing and rape against its victims in China and elsewhere. The Soviet Union deliberately targeted the Polish officer corps for execution so as to leave Poland essentially decapitated. So when the war is over, the Russians could dominate Poland. This is cold-blooded murder for the purpose of dominating Eastern Europe on the part of the Soviets. Germany sought to destroy the Jewish population, as we've already mentioned, in the Holocaust, and again achieved approximately 50% of the prospective numbers of Jews that they had listed. And then, of course, the United States dropped 2 atomic weapons on Japanese cities, killing a couple 100,000 Japanese civilians. So whatever line there may have been morally was clearly crossed repeatedly in the 20th century during the Second World War. Now, the second theme, key decisions that reverberate around the world. I'm going to talk about 2. We're going to talk about the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of August 1939, and then the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and then we'll draw some conclusions. First, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, or the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. Let's characterize it. First, it eliminates Poland. Germany gobbles up the western portion of Poland, and the Soviets gobble up the eastern portion of Poland. It also divides Europe, or divides Eastern Europe between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. It eliminates a second front for Hitler, so Germany can now turn westward and overrun Western Europe, the Low Countries in France, Norway. This Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, of course, rattles the Japanese. The Japanese, of course, are allies with Germany, and the Japanese have designs on Russian territory in the Far East. Well, here Russia and Germany have just signed a non-aggression pact. So this shakes up the Japanese government and it shakes up their strategy. The Japanese now turn their attention southward in order to create, what do they call it, the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, a Japanese empire dominating the Pacific Rim. So the Japanese are going to turn south. This is, of course, is going to call for the attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor to eliminate U.S. interference and Japanese ambitions to dominate East Asia. So let's look at the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Let's characterize it for a moment. It brings the United States into the war, obviously. Now, the United States adopted a Germany first policy. It was decided at the highest levels that Nazi Germany was the more serious threat and needed to be beaten first. And then afterwards, we could devote our resources to defeating the Japanese. The Japanese surprise attack against American territory ruled out any possibility of a compromised peace. The Japanese inclination to fight to the death collides with the United States' insistence on unconditional surrender. These two factors lead to massive loss of life in the Pacific theater. The Japanese-American War will only end with 2 atomic bombings of Japanese cities. And the Soviet declaration of war as Stalin moves his armies to the Far East to fulfill his promise to FDR and to reclaim Russian territories taken by the Japanese earlier in the century. Now, let's draw some conclusions. The Second World War was fundamentally different from World War I, at least in Europe. Nazi Germany undertook to overthrow the international system, to destroy the Versailles Treaty, to destroy nation states, to move and or exterminate whole peoples. I've already mentioned, it bears repeating, that Nazi Germany undertook to murder the entire Jewish population of Europe. Nazi Germany sought to destroy the Soviet Union, to eliminate communism, and to colonize Western Russia with German farmers. Ukraine in particular, the breadbasket of southeastern Europe. Nazi Germany was a state destroyer and a population killer. The Japanese, their atrocities aside, did not contemplate anything quite as radical as Hitler and the Nazis. The Japanese intended to occupy and exploit China, but they did not contemplate erasing China from the map or killing every Chinese. Nothing quite so radical. Brutal, yes, but not a complete overthrow of the system in East Asia. Finally, World War II gave us the immense power of the modern bureaucratic state, coupled with the possibilities unleashed by science. This, of course, is a world in which we still live. So, a brief survey of the Second World War in an attempt to bring world history themes to this very complex and disastrous episode in the middle of the 20th century. Thank you for your attention.